For years, Erika Kirk presented a version of herself that appeared clean, deliberate, and untouched by complication. It was a narrative shaped with intention, one that suggested discipline, restraint, and moral clarity. According to that carefully maintained public image, her life before Charlie Kirk was simple. No serious relationships, no lingering attachments, no personal history that could complicate her role as a faith-centered public figure. It was a story that fit perfectly with the world she later stepped into. In conservative political and religious circles, backstories matter. Image matters. The idea of personal transformation, of arriving unburdened by scandal, often carries as much weight as policy positions or public statements. And for a long time, Erika's story went largely unchallenged. Few questioned it. Fewer still examined it closely. But narratives, no matter how tightly curated, have a way of cracking under pressure. And once the cracks begin to show, questions follow. The first questions. The doubts did not emerge all at once. They surfaced slowly, in fragments. Old photographs here, resurfaced interviews there, and whispers from people who remembered a different version of events. At first, these details seemed harmless on their own, easy to dismiss as misunderstandings or irrelevant footnotes from a distant past. But when observers began to lay those fragments side by side, a different picture started to form. Why were there visible gaps in the timeline Erika publicly described? Why did certain years appear unusually vague? And why did some people insist that her life before Charlie Kirk was far more complex than she had ever acknowledged? The more closely the timeline was examined, the harder it became to ignore the inconsistencies. Before the Kirk name. Long before Erika Kirk entered the national conservative spotlight, she was known by a different name, Erika France. Under that name, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't anonymous. She was, in fact, already a public figure. Winning the Miss Arizona title placed her firmly in the public eye. Beauty pageants, especially at the state level, are not minor affairs. They come with media exposure, interviews, sponsorships, and a documented public presence. Contestants are often profiled, photographed, and quoted. Their personal lives, while not fully exposed, are rarely a mystery. And that's where the first contradiction appears. Public records, archived articles, and magazine interviews from that period do not align neatly with the later claim of having no serious relationships. In several interviews, Erika spoke openly about her personal life, specifically about a man she described with admiration and affection. His name was Tyler J.T. Massey. The relationship that wasn't supposed to exist. According to multiple sources familiar with that period, Erika and J.T. Massey were not casually involved. This wasn't a brief or insignificant connection. By many accounts, it was a long-term relationship that spanned years. There are professional engagement-style photographs, posed, polished, and clearly intended for public viewing. There are interviews where Erika refers to J.T. not as a passing acquaintance, but as her incredible boyfriend. The language used suggests stability, commitment, and future planning. Some sources go further. They claim the relationship progressed beyond engagement plans. They allege that Erika and J.T. had a child together, an assertion that, if true, would fundamentally alter the narrative Erika later presented about her past. This is where the story becomes more complicated. Why was this never acknowledged publicly? If the allegation is false, why do so many people insist otherwise? And if it is true, how could such a significant part of someone's life disappear so completely from public discussion? These questions linger, unanswered. The silence that followed. What's striking is not just the allegation itself, but the absence surrounding it. No public clarification. No acknowledgement. No explanation. For a figure so publicly aligned with values of honesty and transparency, the silence is conspicuous. And silence, in the age of digital archives and viral content, often invites speculation rather than closure. Was the silence intentional? Was it strategic? Or was it simply assumed that no one would ever connect the dots? A photo that changed everything. Years later, during the early days of Donald Trump's presidential campaign, a photograph resurfaced, one that would reignite scrutiny and push the conversation into the mainstream. The image came from one of Trump's early major rallies. At first glance, it looks like many others from that period. Crowded bleachers, patriotic signage, supporters packed tightly together. But positioning matters in photographs. And Erika's position was impossible to miss. She stood directly behind Trump, seated in the top row of the bleachers. It was a prime spot, visible, deliberate, and unmistakably close to the center of attention. But what drew even more attention was who appeared in the same frame. Between Erika and the camera stood a man and a young girl. According to the source who first highlighted the image, the man was J.T. Massey. The child, the source alleged, was their daughter. If true, the implications are significant. This would place Erika in the same physical space, on the same day, with her alleged former fiancé and child, during a pivotal political moment, while publicly maintaining that her past contained no serious relationships. Coincidence? Misidentification? Or evidence of a story left untold? The political overlap. The photograph reveals another layer of complexity. Lower in the stands, visible within the same image, is Tyler Bohr and his family. Individuals connected to the same political and ideological circles Erika would later marry into. This suggests overlapping social and political environments long before Erika's public relationship with Charlie Kirk began. If Erika truly had no significant past relationships, as she later claimed, how do these overlaps make sense? Why does her alleged former fiancé appear in the same political spaces she would later inhabit more prominently? Why does the timeline suggest continuity rather than separation? Once again, questions multiply faster than answers. The story she kept telling. Despite these resurfacing details, Erika continued to present the same narrative publicly. No serious relationships. No complicated history. Nothing that contradicted the image of a woman stepping into public life with a clean slate. But the growing body of evidence made that narrative harder to defend. And then came the video. The private take. In 2014, long before Charlie Kirk, long before Turning Point USA, and long before the Tradwife image, Erika and J.T. Massey filmed a 15-minute audition tape for The Amazing Race. At the time, it was meant to be private. A submission. Not public content. But private footage has a way of resurfacing. What shocked viewers wasn't simply the existence of the video. It was how starkly it contradicted the image Erika later promoted. In the footage, Erika does not project modesty. She does not embody restraint or traditional conservatism. Instead, she appears playful, flirtatious, and physically expressive with JT. She rubs his chest. He makes crude, suggestive movements behind her. The tone is casual, intimate, and intentionally provocative. This is the moment many people point to as the clearest contradiction. How does someone reconcile this footage with later public claims? Was there a genuine transformation, or was a past simply erased? And if transformation was the answer, why not acknowledge it openly? Image versus reality. Transformation stories are common in faith-based communities. They are often celebrated. Redemption arcs resonate deeply with audiences. So why not tell that story? Why insist the past didn't exist at all? That question lies at the heart of the controversy. Because denying a past invites scrutiny in a way that acknowledging it never does. The cost of a curated life. Public figures live under a microscope. Every statement, every photograph, every omission eventually becomes part of the record. Erika's story raises a broader question about modern public life. Can a person truly curate their history in the digital age? And what happens when the past refuses to stay hidden? For some observers, this isn't about moral judgment. It's about credibility. If one part of a story appears misleading, what does that mean for the rest? The questions that remain. As more people examine the timeline, the inconsistencies grow harder to ignore. Why were certain years left vague? Why were public interviews later contradicted by newer statements? Why does physical evidence, photos, videos, and documented relationships conflict with verbal claims? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, what else hasn't been addressed? A narrative under pressure. This story continues to evolve, shaped not by official statements but by rediscovered artifacts and unanswered questions. Whether the allegations are ultimately proven, disproven, or left unresolved, one thing is clear. The narrative once presented as airtight now appears fragile. And in the court of public opinion, fragility invites scrutiny. People aren't just questioning Erika's past. They're questioning the decision to deny it altogether. Because in the end, it isn't the existence of a complicated history that damages trust. It's the refusal to acknowledge it. And once trust fractures, even silence speaks loudly. She had learned early and thoroughly how to make a life look seamless on camera. Erika France moved through public rooms the way a practiced actor crosses a stage. The smile arrives at precisely the right time, the laugh fits the lighting, the pause presses against the story so it lands where she wants it to. On screen she had always been polished, a portrait of reinvention. Offline though, the edges didn't line up so neatly. Old tapes, half-remembered dates, and the contradictory tongues of those who'd once orbited her began to hum, and the hum grew into a low, persistent buzz that threatened to reveal seams she had spent years carefully sewing closed. The first leak was small and stupid, the sort of detail that looks like a fluke until it isn't. Someone uploaded a handheld video to an anonymous channel, Erika, 20-something in earnest, speaking into a cheap camcorder about living in Venice, California, about an early messy life in the shadow of an LA dream. In the tape she mentions Chongqing, China, in a way that implies more than a tourist's curiosity. The cadence of someone who's been there, who knows how to describe the smell of wet concrete after rain, the way a river widens at dusk. Weeks later, on a cable talk show, a clip of Erika surfaced where she insists she'd only visited China for a fortnight. An offhand remark that contradicts the other video's implication of residence. Which one was the lie? Which one was the edited memory? Which was the staged recollection? Those questions arrived like flies, impossible to ignore. People love a tidy timeline. We want beginnings, middles, ends. We want villains and repentant heroes and clean arcs. Erika's story refused to cooperate. One version of her life said she'd been single in New York since 2013. Another said she'd lived in Puerto Rico. Yet another claimed a stretch of cohabitation in California with a man named J.T. Charlie, meanwhile, the man who would later be put on a pedestal by some, never fit neatly into Erika's type, according to those old text messages that somebody had dug up and published. Photos and footage complicated everything else. Erika in 2019 on a program called Summer House, giddy on a date described in captions as both beautiful and religious. A smiling Erika on a couch, attentive, making the right noises. What is identity if not a collection of stories, some true and some manufactured? If one of those stories shifts, how much does the portrait change? Questions multiplied. Who had curated what? Why would someone attempt to erase relationships from the public record? And, perhaps most chilling, what else might be tucked away, just beyond the reach of the cameras? The person who first began tracing the breadcrumbs was a journalist with an itch he could not shake. He started, as many modern investigations do, with an archive. Social posts, tags, timestamps, shadow copies saved on servers no one thought to purge. He stitched together flights, receipts, a photo of a cheap coffee cup with a logo that work forged a timeline. Each new scrap made the picture less tidy and more complicated. For every neat answer, 2 new questions arrived. The journalist did not start with enemies. He started with curiosity, a professional version of the questions that anyone would ask upon seeing the tapes. He followed Erika's trajectory through places that sound like different lives. Manhattan in early morning light, the grit and coffee on the Lower East Side. Venice, with its bicycles and ocean air. Chongqing, where the city folded into itself and the sky was sometimes only a slice. He saw the places she had claimed and had not, the small contradictions that together formed a pattern. Patterns can be read in several ways. To one viewer, they were evidence of a life reshaped by growth and reinvention. To another, they were the footprints of something else, of painstaking curation, of stories landscaped to hide an uneven, perhaps inconvenient, past. Erika was not a cipher. She wrote emails and memos, signed documents, took meetings. She changed addresses with the weary pragmatism of someone moving up and out. She pivoted careers like someone swapping costumes between acts. None of that, on its face, was suspicious. But the more the journalist dug, the more a quiet tension revealed itself between the before footage and the after presentation she had offered to the world. Consider the Peach Bowl in Atlanta, where Erika was photographed, cheering in a trademark scarf, a wide grin, arms up. At her side a man not listed as security, not recorded as family. One source insisted they saw Erika and the mystery man being tactile, intimate in the kind of way two people who know each other's rhythm will be. Later, the source said, that man looked like J.T. Massey, a figure who later became, for many viewers, part mystery, part emblem. The source hedged percentages and probabilities. I'm 87.5% sure, the source said, because certainty rarely lives in eyewitness testimony. But in the absence of absolute proof, the anecdote still lodged in the public imagination. If true, what did that intimacy say about the timeline Erika had presented to her audiences? Every photograph adds a new chapter. Every interview is a lens with blemishes. Which of these versions do we accept as the real one? There is a theater to reinvention. Persona is an economy. Trade-offs, investments, returns. You spend credibility here to gain access there. You prune an inconvenient relationship from a public story and explain the absence as a period of growth, of transformation. You highlight the moments that make you look the way you want to be remembered. That, it turned out, was Erika's art, an ability to highlight. And yet, even the most polished art carries fingerprints. In a cache of old texts, those incomprehensibly intimate artifacts of a social era, a pattern emerged. The same kind of affection, the same list of traits Erika purportedly liked. Charlie, it said, was not that type. JT possibly was. Puerto Rico pops up in several messages. Venice in others. The contradictions were not neatly arranged. They resembled instead the scattering of light through broken glass. What motivated the erasures? Was it shame? Strategy? An attempt to simplify a complicated past for a public that prefers simple narratives? Or something more deliberate? The excising of associations with people and places that, in retrospect, might complicate alliances, endorsements, or corporate assents. If one were cynical, one might imagine a three-act calculus. Cover an inconvenient past, rebrand aggressively, and consolidate power. If one were kinder, one might see a person trying to survive the relentless scrutineering that comes with visibility, trying to control a narrative before others do. Which interpretation seems closer to the truth? That depends on who you ask. Another lane of the investigation turned toward fashion, a world where connections can be both currency and trap. An old interview pitch surfaced, an eager Erika, addressing a small team, outlining a career move into fashion, seeking to work with Diane von Furstenberg. The camera angle was cheap, the lighting flatter than it should have been. But her ambition cut through it. She knew the names. She knew the rooms she wanted to enter. In the archive of rumor and scanned clippings, someone noticed a name. Alexander von Furstenberg. The name triggered a different sort of search, a pull toward a darker history that had been a kind of subterranean current for years. Old photographs placed certain people at fashion shows in the early 2000s. Faces that would later be connected, by others, to deeper scandals. The mention of a name in an archival phone book, Epstein's little black book, some called it, as if civilian archival slang could compress decades of careful secrecy into a single legible object, stung with implication. But implication is not evidence, and hanging a narrative on insinuated contacts is precarious. Reports, pictures, and gossip often move in the same orbit, but rarely on the same plane. A photograph at a fashion show does not, by itself, suggest complicity in anything. A name in a directory is not proof of moral hazard. Yet the human mind is associative. When fear and curiosity are fed a stream of barely linked details, it begins to see pattern where none may exist. What happens when people start to believe the pattern, regardless of whether it's real? Erika's public person had grown into a CEO, a leader, a curated brand. Her interviews were measured. Her speeches clipped to the cadence of a consummate presenter. She had learned to be efficient with vulnerability, the kind that builds trust without opening the door to volatility. She became a story about transformation, local struggles, a brush with glamour, eventual ascension. That narrative sold well. It made her recommendations potent. It made her a sought-after figure for panels and summer series. And yet the resurfaced footage introduced an alternative arc. Someone whose early attempts to enter elite circles intersected with names and spaces that, once re-examined, carried uncomfortable histories. The mere presence of overlap, fashion shows, mutual acquaintances, events, made the public's appetite ravenous. People began to ask a different question. Had bits of Erika's past been intentionally excised to protect her brand? So, by whom? What was the calculus? And crucially, if there were excisions, were they always benign edits of self-reinvention, or were some of them made to obscure something more troubling? As with every story that traffics in memory and ambiguity, power and vulnerability were tangled. The people closest to Erika who spoke to the journalist were defensive in both senses, protective of their friend and defensive as if accused. Some said she had made difficult choices to build stability. Others said she had rewritten history to optimize her prospects. The journalist heard both versions and took notes, and the more he listened, the more he felt he was touching the edges of a labyrinth. Was this erasure an act of self-preservation or strategic deception? Or an inevitable byproduct of a person trying to make peace with a messy life? There were the texts that read like a private journal and the public speeches that read like polished advertising. Which of these is more authentic? Does authenticity lie in the messy, raw documents saved on a phone? Or does the polished speech, the crafted and deliberate version, better reflect who someone has chosen to be? Erika's own statements, when available, were taut and defensible. She framed her past as an evolution, a series of moves that brought her to the present. When the journalist asked about the Venice tape and the 2-week China claim, Erika answered with the practiced economy of a professional. She acknowledged being young, imprecise with dates, eager to accept opportunities. She offered the kind of plausible deniability that often suffices in public debates. She did not, however, take the deeper step of opening her archives for outside inspection. She said enough to navigate the questions, but not enough to resolve them. To the public, that was either reasonable privacy or calculated avoidance. And then there was the question of agency. How much of a public person's narrative can, or should, be owned by the public? We demand transparency from figures who occupy our airwaves and speak to our anxieties, but transparency is not always easy to gift. Who decides when a life is complete enough to be accurately told? Who has the right to demand every relationship and every misstep? Erika's story found itself precisely at this friction point. The people who loved the tidy narrative called the leaks irrelevant. The people who wanted accountability called them revealing. Both sides argued as if the archive were the single source of truth. The Peach Bowl photograph remained a kind of totem. It was elegant in its ordinariness. A scarf, a playoff atmosphere, someone leaning into a cheer. But to those looking for narrative fissures, it represented a moment when public performance and private life brushed against one another. Cameras are omnivorous. They take everything in and care little for the stories that will be told later. In that way, footage is merciless and forgiving all at once. Merciless because it betrays the uncurated self, and forgiving because context evaporates with the blink of an eye. Journalists and commentators began to ask the question Erika herself had perhaps tried to avoid. If so much of her public identity had been curated, what else might have been pruned deliberately? The more the question was asked, the louder the alternative narratives became. The feeds filled with threads. Theories begot other theories. The story wasn't tidy anymore. It had become an organism with far too many mouths. When influencers and commentators started to weaponize single images and old clips, the feeling in some corners grew predatory. People wanted scandal, and scandal sells. But then a counterforce rose. Defenders who argued that selective leak culture punished people for outdated mistakes rather than illuminating them. Which side was right? The real answers, as often happens, lived in the small gray spaces between absolutes. People's pasts are rarely immaculate. They are rarely wholly damning. Context matters. Intent matters. The consequences matter. But social media rarely processes nuance at the speed it amplifies outrage, and nuance is a slow, patient thing. In one late-night call, a former friend of Erika's told the journalist something simple and devastating. She was trying to belong. There was no indictment in the sentence, only a weary humanity. Belonging is a motive that can explain both small deceptions and sweeping edits. Wanting to fit into an elite group could lead someone to take small steps that later require larger ones to hide. Wanting to be loved in the right rooms can make people awkward, strategic, performative. If you believe that line, if you believe that at the core humans are, first, seeking belonging, then the contradictions became a story about survival. If you were inclined toward suspicion, the same line turned into a tale about manipulation. Which reading would history favor? Little in life is ever that tidy. Answers shift with vantage point. As the public conversation churned, Erika retreated into a schedule of appearances that sometimes read like defiant normalcy. She spoke at conferences, launched initiatives, and ran panels. She was, perversely, both the subject of the gossip and the engine of a forward-looking brand that refused to be defined solely by the past. Her PR teams issued statements that were careful to minimize drama and maximize mission. Yet the more she attempted to move forward, the more the past seemed to persist as an immovable object. The old tapes or an offhand comment resurfaced at odd intervals, each time sending ripples outward. The public's appetite for a clean narrative did not dissipate. If anything, the contradictions made people more curious. Curious observers asked increasingly pointed questions. Whose version of events could be believed? What is the moral calculus for judging someone whose story contains intentional retellings? One persistent question hung over all the rest. If reputations are currency, what is the ethical way to spend them? There are few ends to stories like this. Sometimes the public forgives. Sometimes obsession burns through reputations entirely. Sometimes the truth, whatever truth that may be, emerges, clear and incontrovertible. More often, however, the truth remains cloudy, parceled across witness accounts, photographed moments, and selective memories. The journalist never found a single conclusive document that proved intentional erasure of relationships as a strategy. He found instead fragments, texts, photos, conflicting statements, recollections. He found people who loved Erika and people who believed they had been misled. He found ambition and calculation, tenderness and political theater. In the end, the story refused to be simple. Erika became both protagonist and emblem. A woman whose public narrative had been shaped like a sculpture to stand under bright lights, and a person whose private corners were messy and human. The resurfaced tapes did not, on their own, prove a conspiracy. They did, however, force a conversation about memory, ownership, and the structural appetite for tidy stories in an unruly world. When the journalist closed his laptop, it was with the sense that he'd done what he could, gathered threads, amplified voices, asked the right questions, and offered no definitive answer. The narrative lived on, not as a single story but as a constellation. People would keep connecting the dots as they wished, and the public would keep choosing sides. And then, as always, new footage surfaced. An old pitch where Erika spoke earnestly about her ambitions in fashion. Watching it, the viewer was left with two competing impressions. The earnestness of someone reaching for a dream, and the whisper of someone who wanted to belong to rooms that had long since decided who belonged and who did not. The greater question was stubborn. How many of us, left to the pressures of ambition and belonging, would edit our histories to survive? And if we did, would we be forgiven, or would our edits become the evidence of a life someone else would use to tell a very different story? There's no tidy ending. Perhaps the only reasonable closure is a question. When memory and image collide, who gets to write the final chapter?